Teithio dros ei llwybrau a thai meddwl hyd. Tir oedd ein dewinoedd ar gan yn un ar gwynt yr
Hello, I'm Helen Pye, Head of Engagement for Snowdonia National Park Authority, and I'll be your host for this week's podcast. This episode is all about how wildlife, farming and food can work in harmony. I'll be exploring how farming in Snowdonia is working in harmony with nature, producing amazing biodiversity and amazing produce. I'll be talking to three brilliant guests, a conservationist, a farmer and a butcher, and they'll be sharing their expertise and insight on this fascinating topic. My first guest for this episode is Robbie Blackhall-Miles. He's from Natur project at Plant Life. Robbie's worked in plant conservation for over 25 years now. He's a true expert in his field. Although he was born and brought up in North Wales, his family's background is farming fruit in Cheshire and Cambridgeshire, and he's also our adopted ecologist on our farm on Anglesey. Robbie, welcome. Thanks for joining us today. We're going to focus the discussion around the brilliant world of Arctic alpines, which is a fascinating topic. Many years ago, when I started as a ranger on Snowdon, the local expert Dewi used to take me to look at the emerging Arctic alpines right at the beginning of the season, and I absolutely loved going to hunt those out. So tell me a bit about your role with Plant Life and the work you're doing with Arctic alpines and the Natur project, Robbie.
Firstly, Helen, I always start my year with going and seeing the purple saxifrages up in Cwmidwell or in Cwmglas. And where the rest of the world is looking at yellow things, I'm looking at purple things. So the project itself is a brand spanking new project, really got underway in November last year. Natur is a partnership between 9 conservation organisations and Natural Resources Wales. We've got projects all over Wales. We're looking at reversing the trend for about 60 plus really threatened species in Wales. And Natur Eryri Arctic Alpines project, which is what I lead on, is really looking at 12 of those species, 10 of which are plants and 2 of which are invertebrates, including the Snowdon beetle and a little thing called the Arctic pea clam, which is about 2 millimeters long and occurs in some of our really special upland lakes. But it's the plants that are my thing. And we have some of Britain's rarest plants growing in Snowdonia, one of which there's only 6 left in the wild in the whole world.
Which one is that, Robbie?
That's the Snowdon hawkweed, Hyraceum snowdoniense. I was very lucky to go and visit it last year. It grows on just a couple of ledges up in the Nantfrancon Valley, and we thought that there was only about 3 of them left. In 2002, a guy called Dr. Tim Rich went and refound them after 50 years, and then last year a friend of mine, Alex, and I went and we found a further 3 plants, which is pretty exciting, but still only 6.
You remind me of the guy that I used to kind of go on these trips with, Dewi. He's in his 80s now, and he's written quite a few books on Snowdonia, and he's written a book about the Victorians and how they used to come and hunt for these rare species and then kind of scoop them up and take them away to their little botanist gardens in London. But there was local guides who actually were the original botanists who knew where all of these plants existed. And you remind me of those, I think. You're the kind of local guides.
We had a guy called Will Boots, or William Williams, that lived here in Llanberis during that period, and Dewi writes about it in one of his books. And Will Boots was probably Wales's first plant conservationist. Although he was taking people up into the mountains to go and dig up plants and what have you, he also realised that some of these plants were becoming scarcer, and so he started to, instead of just going and digging them up, he started collecting seed and cuttings of the plants and growing them in a garden in the mountains so that he could sell those plants instead of digging them out of the wild, which I think is an absolutely fascinating thing. You know, this kind of guy that was literally living sometimes on the edge, you know, doing anything that he could to make a living, became potentially Wales's first plant conservationist, which I find absolutely inspiring. He probably did an awful lot of damage to the plant populations, and particularly for one called Woodsia ilvensis. And he actually died trying to collect Woodsia ilvensis on Clogwyn Gardenedd on Wyddfa, which is a bit crazy. He had a static rope there, and his static rope broke. His grave is in Llanberis Church, and Will Boots, yeah, he did probably quite a lot more damage than he did good, but he's still a real hero of mine.
Yeah, he sounds like a real kind of entrepreneurial rogue of the plant world, and I think people like that in Wales hold a special place in our hearts.
Yeah, I mean, there's so many entrepreneurial rogues in Wales.
Absolutely. Okay, let's talk a bit about Snowdonia's landscape. You know, I think people see Snowdonia as being a wild landscape. When I was at university, I studied conservation, and one of the kind of things that they tried to drill into us was there's not many places in the UK that are truly, inverted commas, wild anymore. You know, most of the landscape is influenced and impacted somehow by man, in the way that we farm or use land or what have you. But Arctic alpines are the kind of exception to that rule in a way, aren't they, Robbie?
Absolutely, and this is what fascinates me most about them, is the fact that Britain as a island, and or a collection, that the British Isles as a collection of islands was once absolutely covered, apart from a few little mountain tops, by an ice sheet. And then about 10,000 years ago, that ice sheet receded, and those things that were still stuck on those mountain tops crept back down the mountains and found themselves in refuges, on ledges, on cliffs, on the tops of boulders, and on the suitable geology for them. And we have some very special geology in Snowdonia that's suitable for some of these alpine plants. And effectively, those cliff ledges in Snowdonia and the tops and those plants that you find on the tops of those boulders in Clwmidwal and what have you are Britain's only real, truly native, untouched by the hands of man plants and plant communities. And I just think that that's absolutely fascinating. These things have been in our landscape for somewhere in the region of 10,000 years, and they remain there unhindered by the things that we do to our environment. Literally everywhere else in our environment is managed to some extent by people, whether it be through agriculture, whether it be through fisheries, whether it be through, you know, all kinds of different things, mostly agriculture actually. And yet there's these little plant communities still stuck there on their ledges that have remained completely unchanged.
Which is absolutely fascinating, isn't it? And You mentioned at the start of our chat that there's these kind of very kind of rare species that you're looking at protecting. Are there any potential implications for those species in terms of their protection? What are the threats to those species that you're trying to kind of mitigate against, I guess?
Well, I think the thing that always strikes me about them is actually the land area that's suitable for some of these species to grow in is actually much bigger than those cliff ledges. Below the cliffs, there's a lot of suitable geology. There's a lot of suitable area where these things could be growing, but they're not for whatever reason. Very often that's because they are either undergrazed or overgrazed habitats in those areas. When I say undergrazed, sometimes for things like the Snowdon beetle, it needs a very specific habitat with a lot of time in it. And if that habitat is undergrazed, then actually there's too much grass and the time doesn't get going. And if it's overgrazed, then actually all the time disappears out of the habitat and you just get one species of grass growing in that habitat. So it's not just a case of overgrazing is a threat to them all. Sometimes undergrazing is a threat to these plants and invertebrates as well. So there's threats to these plants in that way. Also, climate change is a huge threat to plants in the mountain environment. And that's not necessarily because they haven't got anywhere higher to go. Actually, the tops of our mountains probably are really good for them to remain on still, but it's the other plants that are slowly moving in to those environments and taking up the niches where these Arctic alpines are growing that are the problem. And the implications on their flowering times from climate change. Sometimes they're flowering earlier than their invertebrate pollinators are emerging. And so there becomes this mismatch between the two things, alongside a whole host of other threats, not least of all, Will Boots and his over-collecting in the 1800s, which has left some of our Arctic alpine populations so low that they can't cross-pollinate each other. The populations are completely separated from one another.
That's a really interesting connection back to kind of early tourism, I guess, and the demands that placed on the area. I guess you could argue that Will Boots was kind of responding to the demands of the kind of Victorian visitors and what they wanted, and that was the original impacts of tourism, and now we're seeing kind of different pressures again, I guess. Going back to the kind of topic of grazing, which is one that always fascinates me. There's probably three kind of main types of animal that we see grazing on the hills. We've got the feral goats, we've got sheep, and more we're seeing cattle grazing on the hills. I've noticed there seems to be a kind of shift to maybe a more kind of mixed grazing, and certainly kind of new technology systems like no fence system will open that up, I guess, to more potential for grazing cattle, for example. Can you kind of talk a bit about the kind of pros and cons, I guess, of those different types of grazing, and also the kind of management of that as well? Because I guess in Cwm Idwal, there's a kind of the use of shepherds to manage where the sheep go.
You and I have talked so many times, Helen, about, and this is actually where we became friends, is this discussion surrounding grazing and the way that you graze your animals on your small holding allows for a really diverse network of all different habitats to be achieved, which is why your small holding is so rich in biodiversity, because there's all different, a mosaic of different levels of habitat appearing across the whole farm. Historically, we used to produce on Anglesey and on the Llane Peninsula somewhere in the region of 6,000 head of Welsh black, or actually it wasn't Welsh black, it was ancient Welsh cattle per year to send down to the markets of the southeast of England, and they were moved through Snowdonia by the drovers. The people of Snowdonia were also producing cattle, but they were doing it in conjunction with sheep. They were doing it in conjunction with goats. They were also farming geese and pigs, and so there was a whole mixture of grazing animals being used in our uplands as well as in our lowlands. And they were being utilised in lots of different ways too, more different ways than just for meat. Now, what that would have meant is that in the past there would have been a really diverse mix of habitats because of the way that these animals were grazing. It would have created a very close simile to the much older and more ancient big herds of grazing animals that would have appeared interglacially and just after the last ice age and all the way through until the agricultural revolution in the Neolithic. And what we're now seeing is a change in that. So post-war, we saw lots more sheep grazing in the uplands, and right up until now, the animal that we come across most in our uplands is sheep. But this now move back to having more grazing from cattle in our upland is having a really positive impact in some areas, because it's creating that mix of grazing that creates these diverse habitats in our uplands. And I would love to see more of that.
Yeah, I would love to see that as well. You know, Snowdonia beef is definitely a brand that I think is already popular and will be kind of increasingly popular in the future. And you know, if there's this model that we're shifting to about farming in harmony with nature, and where, you know, farmers are able to thrive off the land, you know, and also produce incredible habitats at the same time, and enable these kind of Arctic alpines to thrive, then that's the kind of ultimate, isn't it? So I think we're sort of coming to the end. The time has just flown by chatting to you, Robbie. Is there anything that you're going to be kind of working on over the next year that you think would be really useful or interesting to highlight to our listeners?
So we are currently in the development phase of natur amaeth. So we're trying to understand what natur amaeth will look like as a project. We're doing a lot of research into the threats that face the Arctic alpines, understanding what the Arctic alpine populations look like. But the other thing that we're doing is we're going to be doing some consultation and trying to understand what people want this project to look like. So this isn't about, you know, this is what we have to do to conserve these plants. This is about what do other people within the communities around Snowdonia feel that should be done to conserve these plants, and how can people interact more fully with the Arctic alpine species that inhabit Snowdonia. Not talking about getting millions of people up into the uplands to look at purple saxifrages every February and March, but just creating awareness around the fact that they're there, they're special, and we want to do something to help them.
It's really exciting work, Robbie, and I'm can't wait to see everything develop. It's been such a pleasure to speak to you today, and good luck with the project this year and all the great work you're doing to protect these amazing species. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Helen.
Many of you will have heard of my second guest, Teleri Fielden. Teleri farms sheep and cattle in Snowdonia and is an absolute inspiration for many of us females in the farming world. Teleri, thank you so much for joining us today. Tell us a bit more about your farm life.
Good question. So we're tenant farmers, and we're in quite an interesting spot. We're where the old estuary used to be. So just in Namor, south of berthynas. So we've got amazing sort of floodplain meadows, but also quite a challenging place to farm. So we're mostly sort of flat land, rushy land, wet pastures with a few sort of woody hillocks in amongst it. And then we also rent a bit more hill land, and we also have some cattle grazing and some woodlands around the place as well. So feels like we spend our weekends being cow chauffeurs, to be honest, shuffling them around different parts of Eryri. There's worse ways to spend your weekends.
Absolutely. How many acres have you got down there?
The farm down here itself, Hafod y Llyn Isaf, is 110 acres. And then we've also got, the upland and some woodland as well. So fairly sort of, standard small family farm size, I suppose.
And you were saying it's, I guess Snowdonia and the sort of terrain that you farm, it's kind of the extreme end of farming, isn't it?
Yeah, definitely. So obviously because we are so low down, I think the bottom of the farm is 3 meters above sea level. So we definitely get flooding. So I've now got waders and a canoe. But then also we've got, because we rent a bit of hill farm as well. So we've got all the all the challenges. And then in the woodlands, obviously you spend half your time sort of wading through brambles to try and find the cattle. So I'm definitely one of the fittest I've ever been.
And what breeds of cattle do you have down there?
We're only just starting out, so we've actually got quite a medley of cattle at the moment. We've not quite settled on one breed. We've just been choosing ones that are sort of basically quite hardy, that can live outdoors all through winter, because we don't have any sort of suitable sheds, and that are very quiet. So we've got Welsh Blacks, we've got Belted Galloways, we've got some Shorthorn Cross Dexters, we've got some Hereford Cross Galloways, and we've got some Shetland Shorthorns as well. So a real pick and mix at the moment. I'm sure most farmers look at it and grimace, but we're just working it out at the moment.
Oh, I love that. We farm Shetlands ourselves, and we've gone through Dexters as well. And I get that. It's kind of trying to find the cows with the sort of right personality and temperament, and also that can kind of not survive but thrive in those conditions, really. And it's different breeds are kind of adapted really for different areas, aren't they? Which breeds are you finding are kind of doing best at the minute?
Good question. A lot of our Shorthorn crosses are doing quite well. They've been crossed with quite sort of smaller breeds, so like you say, sort of the Shetlands, etc. So they're quite, they've got a pretty shaggy coat as well, and they've actually sort of killed out better than we thought. Just like you say, trialing it all out at the moment. And for us, we've been quite careful with because we're starting out, we've obviously had to kind of buy stock in. So we've had to buy them from places that are used to having ticks on them as well, so that you don't get red water. So we're just sort of making sure that we've got, like you say, sort of hardy enough cattle and quiet enough as well, so that we can get them off a large area or find them in the woodland.
Fantastic. Really fascinating to kind of chat through that, really, and maybe learn a bit more about how in terms of how you're using the cattle for enhancing biodiversity in the area that you farm, because I know you're kind of going all the way from the rearing to the kind of killing out and then the producing the meat. Mm-hmm. And we had a great discussion with Robbie, our previous guest, on how kind of farming can kind of benefit nature, and that ultimate balance of if you can produce amazing food and produce fantastic biodiversity, then that's the ultimate goal, really. So how do you find that with your cattle?
It's sort of early days, but it's I do find it really satisfying, like you say, taking them to the end. I mean, it's a lot of work, and because both of us work as well, you're sort of trying to fit it into the farm and the jobs, and obviously it's no mean feat trying to market the produce and all the labeling and selling, etc. But we've been really, really, really chuffed and just kind of quite honoured by people's response to it, really. I think it's quite interesting seeing the difference in terms of the meat quality. Like you really see the sort of completely pasture fed stuff, the fat is quite yellow. And we've had, I mean, we're very much starting out and beginners, but we've been quite taken aback by the comments people have said about how amazing the meat is and how different it's tasted. I think it's possibly got that slightly stronger taste as well, because maybe they're eating quite a variety of different things, and they're much older animals as well by the time they've finished with us. So it's been, it's really interesting, because you just don't, I don't think we're doing anything massively special here, and yet people seem to really notice it in the taste, which is really interesting. And I suppose it makes sense if they're having a sort of varied diet that does come across in the meat as well.
Yeah, and we'll have a butcher joining us as our third guest, and he's kind of really passionate about using rare and native breeds because of that amazing flavour, but also, being really careful about how they've been reared and, being fed on grass, on pasture. He's saying kind of the discussions we've had before recording the podcast, saying that they, that makes a real difference. And what about the biodiversity benefits that you see from the cattle?
Well, yeah, it depends where we're grazing. We do a bit of a mixture of things. So the hill land that we graze, Beard Fai, in Nant Gwynant, that hadn't had cattle on it since the 60s. It was quite a millennia dominated hillside. So what we've done there is basically very low numbers of stock, really low numbers of cattle over quite a large area. And so it's just getting that little bit more of diversity in. So some places that they've grazed down much more, some places that they've left, so it's still scrub, and other places that they've poached up or pushed through. So it's just giving other things a chance to come in and break up that sort of millennia dominated sward. And then there's also a few bits of peat bog there as well. So we sort of weren't wanting that to scrub up as much. So quite useful if the cattle can graze that off. Whereas conversely, down on the sort of the lowland pastures we've got here, we tend to, or we're trying to mob them up much more. So we're sort of grazing them quite intensively in places, but giving it a much longer rest. And we found actually with the rushes that is starting to help. Particularly on the riverside meadows, where you've got an amazing mix of different species actually. And I think because it's quite sandy, it's quite sort of nutrient poor anyway. But the cattle are sort of getting through that, and the sheep as well, that grazing together, but sort of getting down through that thatch, grazing off, and then it's having quite a long rest period then. And then the woodlands are slightly similar to the upland area, really, in that we've got small numbers sort of pushing their way through and opening up a few areas. There's one woodland that we're grazing that it's in quite nice condition, but yet because it's a special area of conservation for its mosses and lichens, and there was a lot of quite nice scrub and quite sort of shaded in habitat, I suppose, but we've just been using the cattle to try and open it up a little bit more and let those sort of that ground flora come up. And it's been really interesting there because that hasn't had livestock on it for years and years and years. It's surrounded by forestry. And we really noticed the insects, just, kind of flies initially sort of following the cows around. But definitely the insect life sort of in amongst the poo. Not that I stare at poo a lot, but really sort of noticing that now. So that's quite exciting.
Yeah, do you think that's related to the dung, or just generally having kind of large herbivores kind of wandering around? What do you think it's related to a particular thing, or?
It's probably a mix of things. You do notice that there's a lot of bugs in the poo itself. But then I suppose you've got the knock-on effect of that is that then they're feeding everything else. So you've then got the sort of birds following them around, etc. So yeah, it's been really nice to get livestock there because it was a hill farm in the 60s, and then it was forestry, and then one area's opened up again. So yeah, it's really exciting to see that change.
Oh, that's fantastic to hear, Teleri. Just the difference that you're able to make to that environment. I've got kind of two final questions because I think we're nearly out of time. So the first one is, what's the most challenging thing about farming in Snowdonia?
I think here for the farm we're on now, it would be the flooding, and obviously that is set to increase with climate change. So for us here, that's the most challenging because it rises up so quickly, and obviously you sort of got to balance the safety of the livestock and yourselves, and then obviously the soil doesn't have a great time when it's sitting underwater for a long time. So I think the flooding, on the sort of physical aspect, and then I think the other challenging thing for farming at the moment is mostly the sort of uncertainty that's around as well, just in terms of trade deals with Australia, and then changing new schemes, and we're not in any environmental schemes at the moment, and there's nothing available to us, so that's definitely quite challenging. But
yeah, hopefully we'll get some kind of more ideas of what's going to happen with that soon, eh? And okay, what's the most rewarding thing about farming in Snowdonia?
I mean, it's a boring answer, but the beauty, it is when we're sort of in our, as an example, this is a bit cheesy, but if you're in the riverside meadows here with the cattle munching and you've got the swallows sort of swooping around, and you can look, for us, we look sort of back towards Wyddfa, and then you look over to the right and you've got Cnicht and Molen Mawr and Molen Bach. So it's a pretty stunning landscape, definitely, and I think quite exciting how for us we're really enjoying using the farming as sort of a way to increase biodiversity. So yeah, I love that win-win about it, but for me the favorite part of farming is just the animals.
Same. Oh, Teleri, it's been so lovely speaking to you today, and all the best with all the work that you're doing in kind of looking after our amazing national park, and hopefully we'll speak to you again soon.
Great, diolch yn fawr.
My third guest, Iain Miles, is the butchery sales manager for Castell Howell Foods and covers Wales and its borders counties, supplying meat to hotels, restaurants and the public sector. Iain, thank you so much for joining us today. Can you tell us a bit more about your background and the exciting work you're doing on meat provenance and quality?
Yeah, so at the tender age of 42, as I am now, I've been in the trade for nigh on 30 years, starting in the very lowest rung of the food chain, if you like, which was in the gut room and an abattoir. Working my way through that process into the boning halls, found that this was something that I really enjoyed doing. Went to work for a very well-known butcher in Wales to do my apprenticeship, and it just went from there, really, and it became more of a passion than a job, which may sound a bit weird, but meat is my life. I live it and breathe it, and yeah, it's taken me to the place I am now, where I deal with some of the best chefs in the country, and I get to supply some of the best meat in the world, as far as I'm concerned.
That's amazing, Iain. And I've heard that you've got this real passion for kind of regenerative farming, for rare breed animals, for native breed beef in particular. And a lot of the discussions we've had on this podcast have been around this idea of farming in harmony with nature, and how using the right techniques and the right animals, that actually you can have a positive impact on the environment whilst also producing some amazing food. So tell us a bit more about kind of the ideas you have and the kind of types of sort of beef that you look for, and what difference you think that makes.
Yeah, well, I think that the industry as a whole through the coronavirus pandemic has changed and has had to change. People were, as hospitality industry had to diversify, and chefs had to diversify into different areas, doing sending out box meals and, you know, sending out their produce via mail order. You know, you could buy a steak from Tom Kerridge, if you like, you know, or eat the very best Wagyu in the world, you know, and, you know, because people had more time to cook, they were doing that. And the way that has affected the industry to date is that people have become far more discerning about the meat that they eat. That is alongside the drive for people to eat less meat, you know, and the push on veganism, people eat, you know, and the environmental impacts that are being portrayed as far as that sector is concerned. You know, people are far more invested. You know, people who do eat meat, who are carnivorous or omnivorous, who do eat meat, you know, they are eager to understand where their meat came from, how it was reared, what breed it was, whether it was mature, dry aged, you know, whatever the story is, they're eager for that sort of information. My sort of passion for native breeds initially came a little bit later on in my career, when I got involved more in the livestock purchasing aspect of the business, and was involved with farmers and, you know, being involved with the animals as they were, and it sort of just sucked me in, really. And the one thing that did suck me in, the type of cat, the animal that did suck me in, was when I found out that everybody's aware of Welsh black beef. A friend of mine phoned me up and he went, everyone calls me Miles. Hey Miles, he said, I've got a Welsh white in my lairage at the moment. And I went, you're having a laugh. Don't, you know, no way. And it was a Welsh white. And after investigation, I found out that Welsh cattle, it wasn't just Welsh black beef. There's an ancient breed of Welsh cattle, and they can be Welsh red, Welsh white, belted Welsh, Welsh black. It was only when the Welsh Black Cattle Society came in that they predominantly went for the bloodlines for Welsh black beef, black gold from the Welsh hills, so to speak. You know, and it just stemmed from there, really. You know, went into finding out about we have a native breed of cattle for North Wales, which is the Faenol, which is, you know, very, very close to the heart of Snowdonia, the Faenol estate. And that was a feral animal that isn't actually living on the Faenol estate. And me and my brother Robbie, we always have this sort of thing where, you know, he's quite interested in getting some cattle, you know, to conservation graze land. And I sort of say to him, wouldn't it be nice to get some of the Faenol cattle back into North Wales, you know, possibly not on the Faenol estate, but what a story that would be. You know, and it just stemmed from there. And then I suppose the regenerative farming aspect of it, I suppose that has come it's quite new to me, if you like. I mean, I know that I think this is driven by frustration, but from the drive on eating less meat. You know, if you look at farming in Wales, or the UK for that matter, as a whole, I would suggest that the large 95% of farmers in the UK, and certainly Wales, farm regenerative farming methods. You know, whether that be the livestock that they use to graze their land, or, you know, whether they're how they rotate their stock and things like that. They're using regenerative farming methods. But I suppose it's about that interest then drove me to look a little bit further into it. And then obviously the crossover then comes with the native breeds and the reasons why they are in particular the best to use when you want to look at conservation grazing, regenerative farming, you know, working alongside natural habitats. like woodland or, upland habitats, and looking at those native breeds and deciding which ones would suit best, So I suppose that's where the interest comes from. And then from a commercial aspect, I'm always looking for the next thing that chef wants. Now, I deal, as I say, with, some of the best chefs, I believe, in the country. A lot of them I regard as my friends. And they always look to me for the next thing. What's the next thing? What's the next story that I can tell? So I'm always looking for that story, and there's some fantastic stories, especially in Snowdonia. There's a gentleman now, or a family now, that are breeding Wagyu in Snowdonia. So you've got Snowdonia Wagyu now. What a fantastic story that is to be told, and they are using farming methods that are in keeping with that sort of the story and the regenerative farming methods. And there's people farming Dexters. I've got a lady by me where I live in Colwyn Bay. She's got a nice herd of Dexter cattle there, which, from a conservation grazing point of view, what animal could be more perfect from the size of its hoof, the type of mouth, the type of plants, and the how much it will graze, just perfect. So all that sort of stuff sort of floats my boat, and it not only floats my boat, but by being able to access these sorts of things like Dexter beef or Welsh black beef, or at the moment we're looking at ex-dairy cattle, retired dairy animals, from a sustainability point of view, to know that they are going back into the food chain, and that is the next thing that's sort of coming along, and people are starting to ask for it more because they want that story to tell. So from
it's
that point of view,
really interesting that you talk about the ex-dairy cattle. So we keep a herd of Shetland cattle, and we had a really old cow. She was 16, I think, and she'd kind of not had any calves for a few years, and so we sent her off, and we had her hung for quite a long time. Because I was a bit worried about kind of how tender is the meat going to be. And it is the most, because Shetland beef is quite similar to Dexter. I don't know if you've ever tried it, but it's it's quite similar in that really kind of like rich, earthy flavour. But this old cow that we had is the most amazing beef I've ever had, and anybody who tried it was like, this is insane, marbling, like almost looked like Wagyu beef. And it's really interesting that you talk about kind of all these sort of elements that form together, and where we're kind of producing amazing habitats, but also amazing quality beef, which can potentially be carbon neutral as well. There's a massive opportunity for kind of North Wales and Snowdonia in that sense, isn't there?
Yeah, huge opportunity. The opportunity lies in the story that you tell. Do you know what I mean? Like, certainly from a commercial aspect. I mean, the romance of it, if you like, you see a herd of white parks strolling through an open woodland, and it's just that sounds really weird maybe, but the romance of that to me, is, what could be more perfect? And it's the opportunity that we have in Snowdonia, and Snowdonia National Parks, and I know the National Trust, and people who are looking after these habitats, the opportunity they have, not just to gain revenue, but make a mark for others. It's huge. The potential is massive, and as I say, the best chefs in the world, they're all looking for the story. And what better story can you tell than the black gold from the Welsh hills? Fantastic.
And like you saying, that is the thing, isn't it? It's about reshaping that story, and I think we've all seen farmers get really frustrated about the sort of stories that they see in the kind of public realm, you know, the Netflix series on kind of
terrible.
you know, around a simplification of what the production of beef is. You know, it's like comparing apples with pears in some senses, isn't it? And if there's an opportunity there to kind of reshape that story about the reality and the beauty of potentially of kind of beef production in an area like Snowdonia, then, you know, that could be a positive way forward.
Huge. And I think that the narrative has been swayed one way in particular. And, you know, it's down to the farming industry and the meat sector to be able to shine a light really and show that what we do in Wales, what we do in Snowdonia, what we do across the country really is to the highest possible standards, you know, the highest possible standards as far as animal welfare is concerned, you know, and, you know, we just want it to be the best.
Thanks, Ian. Do you know what? I think we're running out of time, and I could honestly talk to you about this for hours. We could probably have like a 24-hour just episode on talking about beef. And, you know, that is one of the amazing things about Snowdonia, I think, is kind of the people, you know, their connection with the land, you know, the connection with farming. It's kind of a huge passion for us all, I think. Yeah. So I really appreciate your time today. It's been an absolute pleasure talking to you, and I think we'd like to have you back again soon, I'm sure, to kind of explore beef and farming and wildlife in more detail. Thanks, Ian.
Yeah, lovely. Thank you.
Our next podcast will be a Welsh one, and our Head of Cultural Heritage will be interviewing some amazing guests about the World Heritage status. A huge thank you to all the guests for this week's podcast. You can listen to past podcasts on Spotify, iTunes, Amazon and Google Podcasts, and you can follow us on Twitter, Instagram, Facebook and even TikTok.